trip and fall, get gored by one of the mountain goats up there, whatever. Whatever hazards might befall you.
Frequent mountain goat gorings that we hear about in Colorado.
Well, you sometimes see people doing not the smartest stuff out there, so
Yeah.
it could happen.
True. Welcome to the Greens and Blues 14er podcast. This episode, Zach grows a blue beard, I almost get goat gored, and we sit down with the executive director of the Colorado 14ers Initiative, Lloyd Athearn. Well, Zach, what are we going to be talking about today?
I don't know, Eric. What are we talking about today?
We should probably come up with something.
We need an idea or a concept.
Yeah.
No, today we're going to be talking with Lloyd Athearn from Colorado 14ers Initiative. I think we had this idea, we probably had this idea 2 years ago, and we just now got around to it, but really wanted to talk to, so Lloyd is the executive director of the Colorado 14ers Initiative. And for those of you that don't know, these are the folks that, and Lloyd will go into detail on this in a sec, but these are the folks that do a lot of, their principal task is doing really amazing trail reconstruction, restoration, and maintenance on our beloved 14ers. And they also do a lot of other stuff that Lloyd's going to talk about, but that's really kind of the lion's share of the work that they do. And we've been wanting to talk to them to hear more about it and weigh in on some issues of land use and land management, but also to hear what they've got going on this year. It's the beginning of summer hiking season, and we wanted people to hear what's going on, what they're up to, and if they might encounter some of these guys on the trail. So Do you have anything you wanted to add to that, Eric? Why are we here, Eric? That's the big question.
Why are we here? The only other thing I would add is we also wanted to kind of get a little bit of maybe a personal side to him as to, why he has been so motivated to head up the CFI for, gosh, he's been with the CFI for like 15 years at this point.
Yeah.
So he's been there for a while, but we wanted to dig into, like you said, what they're about, what they're involved in, but also kind of dig a little bit into his personal side, why he's so passionate about 14ers. We're looking forward to a good conversation.
That's a great place to move on now to our conversation with Lloyd Athearn.
Well, we're here with the executive director of the CFI, Lloyd Athearn. Lloyd, welcome to the Greens and Blues podcast.
Thanks. Good to be here with you guys.
Lloyd, it's great having you here. I think you guys do tremendous work. And I guess just to kind of start with, what work do you do? What is the Colorado 14ers Initiative? How did it start? Maybe give us a sketch of where it started, but also where it's evolved to at this point in your institutional history.
Colorado 14ers Initiative is a nonprofit partner of our federal land agencies. So principally the U.S. Forest Service, but there are also 3 14ers on the Bureau of Land Management lands in the state. We have been working for 31 years now to preserve and protect the natural integrity of our 14,000-foot peaks through active stewardship and public education. So in practice, that means that we have to date built 41 summit routes on 36 of the 14ers. I kind of let people decide whether they want to go with the 53 number, the historic 54 number, the 58 number, like sort of agnostic on that question. So we are the principal organization that's out there raising money, engaging volunteers, and doing the hard work to build trails, maintain them, because they're all natural surface trails. They occur in some of the steepest, most erosive environments and are subject to snow melt in the early season, summer thunderstorms that can dump, an inch or two or more of rain in the matter of a couple of hours. So you also have then the boots of hundreds of thousands of hikers a year, constantly changing environment. We're never going to really be putting ourselves out of work, but we're the kind of the muscle that makes all this stuff happen. I know people who go climb the 14ers must think it's either federal agencies or it's trail gnomes in the middle of the night. We're the ones that actually get the work done. And people know us a lot for the the trail work, but we also focus a lot of time on hiker education. We try to get our crews trained up so that they are conversant in talking to hikers. We also have volunteers known as peak stewards that go out. Sometimes they'll hang out at a trailhead. Other times they'll, hike the peak until that point where people are usually gasping and waiting for their first breath, and then kind of talk about Leave No Trace and the unique fragile environment found on the 14ers. And then we also, knowing that people come from all over the globe to climb these mountains, have developed a YouTube channel with videos that cover everything from mountain safety to unique plants and animals found on the 14ers, how to be less impactful on the mountains. And those, we have almost 100 videos that have had almost 550,000 views. So just try to protect the resources best we can. It's sort of also evolved over the years, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. We've had issues related to 14ers on private land and working to either directly acquire those lands and try to bring them into, public ownership, or for some of the mountains that will likely always be in private hands, try to come up with access agreements, work with our legislature to develop laws that are friendly to landowners who let people come recreate on their peaks for free.
That's really cool. You guys do all this work. When I think of CFI, I think of not necessarily trail maintenance, I think of trail improvement and really kind of trying to remediate to a certain degree the damage that has been done by social trails and so forth. What are some of the ethics? You mentioned Leave No Trace. So obviously there's like an ethic or a philosophy or an idea behind CFI. What are some of those big principles that you guys operate with?
So first big principle is have people on developed trails, not informal social trails. It probably comes as a revelation to a lot of people who climb 14ers that 31 years ago when we started, there were only 3 planned 14er routes in the state. All the others were simply historic goat paths that, climbers created trying to get from trailhead to summit as quickly as possible. They were looking to get up and down before summer thunderstorms hit. There was absolutely no thought process to where a trail should ideally be placed and where it's going to be most sustainable for the long run. They obviously weren't out there actually building a trail. They were just hiking, and they were doing so going through this incredibly fragile alpine tundra ecosystems. The plants there, you can kind of consider them as the astronauts of our biological world, right? They live at the farthest extreme of life on this planet, and they're uniquely adapted to places that are just blasted by sun, wind, snow, freezing most of the time. So they're really resilient and able to live in that landscape. But their Achilles heel is that they can easily be crushed by people trampling on them. So as few as 5 to 10 footsteps on a plant can either dramatically set back its growth or kill it outright. We're in an area where there's usually at most about maybe a foot of soil that has taken, experts believe, about 1,000 years an inch to blow in and form. And so when you have this fragile plant cover that's trampled to death, their roots let go of the soil, and all of a sudden that incredibly vital and rare soil is just washing down the hill and smothering other plants. It was just a real unfolding disaster that hiking groups and the Forest Service saw back 30 plus years ago. What's happening? And because in the early years, you would really have a 14er to yourself. There were very few people going out there. And then all of a sudden in the mid 90s, 14er climbing became a thing. And it became a thing before there was a network of sustainable planned trails. So we've been kind of fighting that battle to rectify the situation ever since, and put in place those planned intentional trails where they're going to avoid incredibly rare plant communities, important animal habitat. We're going to put in switchbacks because climbers were just going what we call fall line, right? If you drop a ball down the hill, that's going to be where gravity takes it the straightest course down. Well, that's the same thing that when you have water on it, that's like a water slide,
Yeah.
It's going to be doing all sorts of damage. So water is our principal enemy. How do we make sure it gets diverted off a trail? How do you have trails that are switchbacking up where water can flow harmlessly off the side of a trail rather than down the water slide, causing force and power and erosion? So really, it's all about leave no trace. It's about sustainable trails. It's about people understanding that the trails are there to be used and they're where you should be, and to not have people cutting switchbacks, not just sort of going willy-nilly around through the alpine ecosystem. Even things like emphasis on safety is principally focused on resource impact. Yeah. So if you think about it, someone who doesn't know that in most days in the summer, you're going to have the potential for lightning, thunder, intense thunderstorms. They don't have a Gore-Tex jacket. They start out at 11 o'clock, this sort of stuff. All of a sudden they get into there's a storm right on top of me. They're probably not going to be walking carefully down the trail, but will be just running all over the place. Yeah. If people don't know where the route is and they go and get lost, now you might have 10 to 15 mountain rescue people trampling around all over in the alpine trying to find them. So even things that seem like they're focused on, we want to have a safe experience, and we do, don't get me wrong, but these mountains can never really be made safe. And so the principal focus is how do we have people able to get out there to enjoy all of these just amazing experiences, being in a landscape that just doesn't exist in most of the country, and have these great kind of perfect days with your friends and family and sense of accomplishment of climbing 14ers, but doing it in a way that's responsible to the unique resources that are up there and that allows people in future generations to do the same thing.
Yeah. Lloyd, I got a question related to the sustainable trail point that you just made. So I know currently, I'm sure we'll get into this in a minute, currently there are projects on Chavano to improve that trail. I know in the past Columbia's had projects to improve that trail. Has there been a comprehensive look at all of the 14ers in the state and how many of them have decent trails versus ones that are really in bad shape and in danger of erosion and that kind of thing? Is there a sense of where we're at with that?
Yes, there is. There's a thing that we created starting in 2015 called a 14er report card, where we've gone out and used GPS devices and kind of a data dictionary to define trail terms and structures and resource impact terms and the severity of those. And so we've had people go out and hike the trails and record all of this data. While they're doing it, they look like the most hopelessly lost people in the world, because they'll walk 3 feet and look at their GPS and do something. And while they're doing it, some of them talked about people saying, "Hey, dude, the trail's over here." And it's like, yeah, I know exactly where it is, but I'm putting in that this rock staircase that we put in has, 3 steps that are starting to get undercut and need to be resolved. So we started with that 2015 report, which showed that we had, I think it was $24 million in needed trail improvements and deferred maintenance. In the 4 years to 2019, we were able to lower that number to 18.4 million. All of the routes have letter grades. They have, if you will, Yelp dollar signs. It's on our website and people can go look for it so they can really get a see. It's color coded from, A's to F and greens to bright red. And so people can see how over time conditions have improved. We also then keep tabs on how much dollar value we've put in, how many, volunteer days, and then we can watch over time as our efforts improve trail conditions and as the forces of nature and people, combat us and see how we're doing. And realistically, the input is the more resources we have to do positive work and stay on top of things, to build out that network of sustainable trails that was never built before people started climbing these, and to do the ongoing needed maintenance, the better the trails are, the better the resources protected. Going back even further, before that happened, because we started that effort in 2011 and again introduced the first report card in 2015, which was partial. It wasn't covering all of the routes. The Forest Service started back in the 90s just looking at, okay, where do we think the highest priorities are? There was also a political overlay on that because there are 6 forests in the state that have 14ers, and they were contributing money based on the number of peaks they had. So knowing you have this kind of daunting list to begin with, like, okay, we're going to start here, but since the money's coming from all the different forests, we have to work our way periodically onto the different forests to make sure we're doing work there. Interestingly, over 30 years, we're now down to where there's really a smaller number of routes that haven't had this major trail delineation effort. And that's in and of itself is about a 5-year process where the agency goes and looks at where people are hiking. They'll look at satellite imagery and get on the mountains to sort of see, well, this is where people took the path of least resistance, but is that really where we want people to be? Mm-hmm. Perfect example there is the standard route to San Luis Peak. Mm-hmm. People were going through kind of a riparian area near a creek because they didn't want to bash through these willows. But when you're putting an intentional route in, you can cut the willows out and you can put it into a drier area, and you're not on this high side slope where waters and soil is going into the stream and eroding the water quality there and the fish habitat. So sometimes where people were going wasn't the right place. And if you're intentionally going to build a trail, you put it in another place. Now, there's always an effort, and especially with money not being unlimited, where are the most important places to do the work and where can we get by just enhancing the existing social trail that was there. So most of our trails are kind of a hybrid. They're very rarely from trailhead to summit fully constructed by us. It's sometimes, hey, in this 2,000 foot section, we really there's no way we can make that climber trail sustainable. Let's put in some switchbacks. Let's move it here over to this ridge and off of the steep slope. And then we end up with much more benign trails environmentally. And we also put in rocks and timbers and other different things to keep the trail tread stable so that it's not eroding. Again, try to get the water off the trail. So something that's just trampled by hikers is going to be purely dirt. And a lot of what we put in is rock and materials that will be much more durable over the long term.
Yep.
So, Lloyd, you've mentioned a couple times the Forest Service, and at the beginning you said it was kind of like a partnership. Where do you guys get your funding from, or what is your relationship to these federal land agencies, typically the Forest Service, but also you mentioned the BLM? Are they funding some of your efforts, or are you privately funded and you work in cooperation with them? How does that work?
I'll sort of flippantly say that we take money in any way except robbing banks and trains, right? We do have some ethical standards where we won't go, but really it's any and all sources that will help give us the resources to do the work, which is expensive. Like this year, we're going to have a budget of about $2.4 million. We'll be hiring 33 seasonal employees, and we have, roughly 40 people at the high point of the year, and only about 5 or 6 of us that are around for essentially full time. So when I got here 16 years ago, most of our money was coming from the Forest Service and a state trails grant program that Colorado and I think all of the US states operate. And then we had received some deep funding from the National Forest Foundation. But there was very little money coming from individuals and very little buy-in from, communities surrounding trailhead areas. And those were, for me, logical places to look. I knew that, the drive that it takes to try to climb more than 50 high altitude mountains, because some people will just come out and climb 114er and say, oh, that was cool. I climbed Mount Bierstedt. Awesome. I don't need to ever do that again. But there are an awful lot of people who are pretty persistent who, oh, there's a list. There's these are cool places. There's an increasingly challenging, list of peaks to climb. Count me in. And I knew that same drive would probably cause people, if they applied that in their professional lives, to be fairly successful. And with that length of time out there, that you'd get people to have an emotional buy-in to these places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's when I really started focusing on trying to reach individuals and try to, motivate those that are philanthropically inclined. And over the last handful of years, we've really had about half of our budget every year coming from individual 14er hikers.
Oh,
and
wow.
that's, everything from someone who can give us a $25 donation to people who can give $25,000. And it all adds up. I know one of the questions you were kind of looking at is, so if you're getting money from the federal government and we're having, DOGE and government cutbacks and everything, how does that affect you? The part that's been really interesting is that by pivoting to more private donors and trying to find the foundations that align with us, continuing to pursue government sources as they exist, it has put us in a much better position so that this year, when there have been a lot of groups that have been getting zero funded or prior commitments have been frozen, we're in this strange idyllic world where we've got our money secure for the year. I mean, there are, a couple of things that might not come to pass, but realistically, we are not anticipating any cuts. And we've been able to have the pick of the litter in terms of seasonal trail crew members, because the Forest Service announced last fall that it wasn't hiring seasonals, and because a lot of other partners that may not be as fortunately situated to where they can get that significant individual giving, that they're not able to hire people. And so we're, as I say, in a very kind of blessed position to be like, okay, we got our most advanced crew we've ever had this year, and our funding is looking very secure for being able to keep them out for the full 4-month season that they're out. They'll be showing up here in about 10 days for our preseason training, and then they'll be working through the end of September out on the mountains, and we'll hope to get a lot of important work done this summer.
Yeah.
I know there's a fair amount of grunt work involved in this, but there's obviously a lot of intelligence involved in this too, like how to properly construct trails and so forth, and knowing how surface runoff works. It's almost like an engineering exercise. People that you hire tend to have some form of expertise. Am I right?
Yes. One of the challenges that we face when hikers come out and see our crews working in the field is kind of twofold. First off, people think, oh, these are all volunteers. And so they're like, hey, thanks for volunteering.
Yeah.
And these people will be like, no, actually, this is my career.
It's my job.
Yeah. And then the second one is that some people think that these are people who are doing some form of restitution for past criminal behavior, right? So they're
community service.
Not only are they thinking that people are volunteers, but they're like, dude, what did you do that made you have to be out doing this hard
Can I
work?
do that too? Can I steal shopping carts? Is that what it's
right? They think that there's some sort of community service that they have to do. And it's really unfortunate that people don't see the tremendous skill development process that some of our advanced leaders have. There's an awful lot that's about physics. It's about, again, trying to build some of the most complex trail structures anywhere in the country. I mean, we have some of the highest rise over run trails anywhere, because we're trying to get, again, from trailhead to summit quickly, not have a lot of circuitous trails. And so there's a lot of understanding how to work with natural rocks, how to work with timber, how to work with the physics of whatever underlying bedrock you might have in an area. We're in these areas where there isn't a whole lot of soil, and you're dealing with trying to build and tie into the rocks and physical structure that's there on the landscape. So there has, again, been this 4-year process of inventorying where the best location for a trail is and laying out various different trail designs and then figuring out how to avoid rare plant communities, things like that. There are construction notes that our crews will have when they're going in to do a major reconstruction project. But there's always that X factor of when the person designing it is looking at it, there's soil there, and a foot down, there's actually a slab of bedrock. And so now you're in this quandary of you can't necessarily put what you thought was going to go in there, and you might have to slightly detour where the route's going to be. You might need to figure out differently how to build it. The other part is that with incredibly rare exceptions and only on the peaks that are outside of congressionally designated wilderness, we have to only work with the natural materials that are available and on site. So that means going and sourcing the rocks from nearby. And that in and of itself is a hugely complex undertaking.
And then hauling those darn rocks too. I see people lugging rocks around and I'm like, you're doing that at 12,000 feet? That is work.
Yeah, so sometimes they can simply lift the rocks and put them into essentially sling netting. And then you might have 4, or if it's a really large rock, 6 people holding up that web netting and physically walking it over to the location. Sometimes the terrain is so steep that we have to use what are called grip hoists, which are kind of a mechanical ratchet system that allows you to sling the rock, and then you'll have a cable to it and you might be lowering it down, or we'll put in place metal teepees with kind of a cable running along it, and you're in a very controlled fashion moving that rock from point A to point B, which is incredibly labor intensive and time consuming. That's why, our trails are without question kind of the most expensive anywhere, because it takes so much time to get materials and get them into the right place. Now, sometimes when we're working outside of wilderness, we've been able to come up with some more creative approaches. So on Gray's and Torrey's Peak, 2 of the most climbed 14ers and most accessible 14ers in the state, we had frankly stripped all of the mountain of the buildable size rock, because you can't use things that are the size of football or basketball. You're looking for things that are more like the size of your sofa or a refrigerator, ideally. And so there just was not any more available rock source close enough to where we were working. And the thought was, well, we have begun shifting to using a lot of timber, but in efforts to try to drag and carry logs that are maybe a foot to 18 inches in diameter and maybe 12 to 15 feet in length. When you're trying to do that using these log tongs, we had volunteers essentially mutinying on us when they were trying to move it about a quarter of a mile. And again, painstakingly slow process carrying it up a trail. And we realized there's just no way we can get it to 2 miles laterally and probably 2,000 vertical feet to where we need it. So we had tried for years to get the National Guard to helicopter logs up. And at some point, after continually getting brushed off and everyone being super psyched about the idea, but no one putting their signature on the line to authorize it, I just turned to one of my colleagues and said, man, can't we just hire somebody to do this? I'm sure there are helicopter groups that will do this. And sure enough, we were able to hire a group, and in the span of about a 4-hour morning, move, I forget how many tons of trees we moved up to 13,000 feet on Gray's Peak, but it allowed us to get the trail stabilized and do the work where otherwise we wouldn't be able to do it. So huge amount, back to your question, right? A huge amount of knowledge, physics, and understanding geology and what rocks are good rocks versus bad rocks. And a lot of then just trail skills learned over years all come into play. We have a continuum of people with experience on our team. We'll work with youth corps and volunteers who oftentimes are simply just moving materials. And then we have entry level people, and we'll work with them for a couple of years and hope that we can promote them up the line to be a project manager, or then some of our higher level managers that oversee multiple projects. There's also a massive amount of logistics involved in this, because again, we have 4 months to get this work done. We usually start with snow on the ground and end with snow on the ground, and it can snow almost any day in the mountains. We have thunderstorms that will come in and disrupt work in the middle of the season. So our crews are oftentimes getting up at 3 a.m. and out the door by 4:30 to 5. Sometimes they might have a couple of hours of hiking before they then get to work. On our Mount Chavano project, which is the biggest, costliest thing we've ever taken on, this year and next year, it's anticipated that like our high crew will every day be ascending and descending more than 3,000 feet, which is, of course, that standard that people
essentially hiking a 14er every day.
Basically.
And they will be working up to the actual summit of the mountain. So for people who think that climbing a 14er is a rigorous activity, keep in mind that these people are going to be every day for 8 days in a row, kind of hiking a 14er by that legitimate standard, and then
working
with trail tools, working, moving rocks, busting their tails in the thin air, and you get a sense of how arduous it is physically. But then again, people sort of overlook the technical aspects. This isn't just randomly moving stuff around, because we build trails to have them survive for 50 years.
So your Chavano comment takes us to, what are the projects you guys have going on this summer? So when people go out and hike, what are some of the big projects you have going on? And then you mentioned the report card. What's got F's on it right now that's going to get some attention in the coming years?
Yeah, so this year is going to be another big year. We are in year 5, I believe it is, of 7 years on Chavano. We will have 2 separate crews working simultaneously. One is a low crew that is working in an area. If you've climbed Chavano, they're kind of in that point where you intersect a seasonal stream on the mountain. It's also near where people can, if they're going to do it and camp, that's an area where they camp. So they're building that section, and by the end of the summer, we will have opened the 3rd and last of our major bypasses on the lower part of the mountain, and then we'll be beginning the restoration of that area. There'll be 6 people from CFI working on that section, and at different points involving volunteers on that. And then on the upper mountain, we'll have 8 crew members working. The area is just way too dangerous and physically demanding to have volunteers, but they'll be camped at that point near the crossing and then headed up every day to work. They're getting to that final sort of summit block. And ideally, we will be able to at least get people off the old trail and hopefully begin some of the restoration on that. There's always a challenge in work proceeds much more quickly if we don't have hikers on the trail than if we do. So when we're doing a bypass and we're working out of sight of where hikers are going, we get more productivity accomplished. But at some point, and we started to run into this last season towards the end, that people going up wouldn't see our crew, but then when they were high on the mountain, they'd look down and they say, "Oh, hey, it looks like there's a nice trail over there. I'm just going to cut down that way." So at some point, probably this season, that will shift, and then we'll begin finishing that route and then doing the restoration of a simply massive erosion scar over kind of above and to the left of where the Angel of Chavano forms, that snowfield. One of the other super exciting projects that we're going to be starting on is work on Mount Democrat. So people may be familiar with what's called the DeCalibron Loop, which links together Mounts Democrat, Cameron, Lincoln, and Bross. That area has had land closures a lot in the past because much of the area up there is old mining claims, which are privately owned. because of issues related to liability concerns, those have been closed. There were a few years in the mid 2000s they were closed, and then I think it was 21 and 23 they ended up being closed. We worked with some other recreation groups and interest under the banner of the Fix Crust Coalition last year to go to the Colorado legislature and get what's known as our Colorado Recreational Use Statute amended so that it provided greater landowner protections. That allowed greater certainty of access in the area. And then the big one was that CFI raised money to cover the transaction costs of a group called the Conservation Fund, which is a national group that buys land and conveys it to government agencies. And so in the fall of 2023, our combined efforts were able to get about 300 acres of land acquired on Mount Democrat that included the summit and where the access trail goes in. So that has provided, it's now been conveyed to the federal government. So it's in Forest Service lands now. And the western half of that loop, Democrat and Cameron, are now fully on public land. And that spurred there's a group in Colorado called Great Outdoors Colorado. It is the spin-off agency for money coming from our state lottery, which is directed to parks and open space, playgrounds, those sorts of things. And that entity was really fired up about work that's been happening on the 14ers, especially in partnership between CFI and the National Forest Foundation. So they had made a large infusion, Democrat being one of the key areas. CFI will be working on building out that trail in a more sustainable way. There also will be other efforts being pursued by other entities on improving the road and changing where camping and parking and toilet facilities are, and really upgrading the infrastructure in the area to handle the significantly high use that loop gets when it's not closed due to access issues. And I'll just add there, of course, I have to add that there's this bypass loop. The summit of Mount Bros remains private land. It is going to be a very difficult thing just due to fractional landowners to get the summit of Bros opened. But the hiking community has long acknowledged that if you do the formal loop, even if you're not touching the summit of Mount Bros, we're going to let you check that box and say that you've done Bros. Be sure to also do the electronic waiver for Mount Lincoln, which remains in private lands. And so while that is open again for people to go back there, it's under the condition that they do complete an electronic waiver beforehand that holds the landowner harmless. If you trip and fall, get gored by one of the mountain goats up there, whatever hazards might befall you.
Frequent mountain goat gorings that we hear about in Colorado.
Well, you sometimes see people doing not the smartest stuff out there, so
yeah,
it could happen.
True. Yep.
So it sounds like you guys have a full slate this year.
Well, but wait, there's more.
Oh, really? Well, tell me, Johnny, what do I have to look forward
Beyond
to?
the Ginsu knife, you have we have a project that we're calling Bluebeard, which packages up in one season of work, half a season fixing the boardwalk on Mount Bierstadt, which so many people call it Mount Beardstat. So that's where the beard part comes
I thought
in.
this was like a CIA Black Ops program, like Project Bluebeard or something.
And then also building trail through a section of the route on Mount Blue Sky, which was obliterated in a landslide back in 2013 where we had a major rain event for over multiple days that caused flooding in Boulder and parts out into the plains. But it was the only thing that was really damaged on the 14ers, but we're doing that. And then we also have what we are now referring to as our Nomads crew of 8 people, usually breaks up into 2 teams of 4, the Marmot crew and the Pica crew. And they go out and do the more routine trail maintenance work. They'll be the ones that are principally working with volunteers, youth groups, other sorts of folks to kind of do the less intense efforts. And looking to put in about 1,000 volunteer days of work this summer out on the mountains. They'll get to about 10 different peaks over the course of the summer. While these other projects on Chavano and Democrat and Bluebeard are kind of doing the bigger, burlier, more technical projects, the Nomads crew will kind of do more of the cleaning out trail drains and removing down trees. And, they'll still put in log check steps and things like that, but it's smaller scale, less intense stuff. We also hope to have folks out doing several trail inventories. Again, that 14er report card, trying to update data. Last year we finished 8 years of work on the 3 main routes on Mount Elbert. So going in and inventorying the work on the Black Cloud route and then the main Northeast Ridge route after we put several seasons of work in on those, so we can see, again, how much time and effort we put in and then how that resulted in the trails to being changed. And then we're also trying to get back to some of the routes that haven't been inventoried in the better part of a decade to see how they've fared over that period. And then and hopefully we'll have someone helping me out placing 23 thermal counters where we track the number of hikers who are out on the trails and then use sort of a modeling program to project hiking use on all of the peaks. So that's all part of our trying to understand how the use is changing, how the trail conditions are changing, and really getting a more comprehensive snapshot of what the challenge is in front of us. Are we continuing to make progress? Are we falling behind in some areas? And then that helps with our efforts to fundraise and say, hey, been doing this for a long time, but we're still not putting ourselves out of work yet.
I don't know if you ever will.
No, we won't. Candidly, we won't. I try to tell people that because, sometimes funders, especially big funders, are thinking, when are you going to be done with this? And it's like, this is a forever challenge.
Yeah.
This is, as long as people want to climb 14ers, there will be the need to be out there because, we're not putting in concrete and steel and, even that erodes after some period of time. But this is working with natural materials in a very steep and rapidly changing environment.
So you mentioned Decalibron. What's the status right now of Lindsay? I know that I don't know if that's necessarily CFI purview, but what's going on with Lindsay right now?
Well, that's been an interesting one. So I mentioned the Colorado recreational use statute. Not to get too into the weeds and geeky, but a lot of our issues related to access to private land stemmed from a mountain biker accident on a trail on the Air Force Academy, where the Air Force Academy thought CDOT was responsible for the trail. That's our Colorado Department of Transportation. Everyone thought someone else was responsible for it. In the end, what the situation was an unauthorized but not posted as illegal paved trail. There was a big washout. A cyclist fell into a very deep sinkhole, had a traumatic brain injury, and filed a lawsuit that ended in I think it was a $7.3 million payout. And that kind of in the late teens, landowners began to say, what? Wait, I have people on my land, and the recreational use statute, which virtually every state has, it tries to incentivize private landowners to allow recreation where they're not charging someone. So that's important. Free recreational access. It largely says you're protected against liability claims. Well, when a verdict like this, an award like this came in, it really shocked people. So that's when the main landowner up in the Decalibron Loop closed the peaks. And that's when the Trinchera Blanca Ranch, which owns Mount Lindsay, closed it. People have been itching to get back there. We've been trying to tell them, hey, let's wait until we solve some of these issues. The first step was getting the law passed in January of 2024. That took effect in August. Then there was time for people to see how that might play out and whether they thought we had changed it sufficiently. And it seems that most of the landowners have. So the ranch in March announced that they were allowing access again under an electronic waiver system. So Mount Lincoln and Mount Lindsay are open. They're both under electronic waiver systems. The Lindsay one is, I believe, called mountlindsay.waiver.com, if I'm remembering it correctly, but certainly Google.
Just amazing that URL was still available. Who knew?
Well, it's in high demand.
Yeah.
So people can get back there legally. We want to just emphasize that the only access that is allowed on Lindsay is coming from Werfenode, Trailhead, coming in that area from the north. You grab that kind of, I think it's a northwest ridge. Yep. You are able to do either the standard route, which goes up a little more under a gully, or you can do the ridge, but you cannot in any way, shape, or form ascend or descend through the ranch. That would compromise access. They've been very generous to allow people to get back there, and people can really mess it up if they don't stay on the route. There are also other terms, not hunting, not doing other different things, which I think most 14er hikers are just there for the hike. But be sure to check out the waiver site and follow the terms and conditions and sign the waiver. Let's hope that they're happy with people getting back there.
Lloyd, this has been awesome to go through the CFI work that has been done, what's currently going on. Let's take a little bit of a sidestep and talk more about you as a person and kind of where you come from, how you got involved with not just the CFI, but your passion for 14ers in general. So do you want to dig a little bit more into the personal side of Lloyd and 14ers?
Sure. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and pretty much every clear day, which is not that often.
So about 20 days a year.
Except in the summer, I had Mount Hood staring out at me, and I was just enthralled with the mountain and first started getting into, I'd been a Boy Scout, I'd done camping, I'd done that sort of stuff. And then when I was in high school, I climbed my first mountain, which was, I think, about 10,000 feet, the South Sister in Central Oregon. So that was pretty darn cool. And then after I had graduated from high school, right afterwards in June, I had gone down to California, and with my father and a group he was with, we climbed Mount Shasta. And again, super cool. Of course, I was a total uninformed idiot and was glissading with my crampons on, had borrowed a friend's ice axe and crampons, had no idea how to use them, managed to survive that. So, as we get to educating people, I'm always aware that Royal Robbins learned to climb with his mom's clothesline. Like a lot of people who've gotten into climbing did some dumb things early on. So let's not be harsh and judgmental with people about it. But I truly got, bit by the mountain bug. And for a while when I studied history and political science, got in working for elected officials, and also had a background in communication. So for about the first decade of my time after college, I was working professionally in that interface between policy and communications, but my love and what consumed most weekends was going out, rock climbing and mountaineering and going all over the place, initially in the Northwest and the Sierra, but then expanding. I climbed in Europe and New Zealand, and
Wow.
And then when a friend of mine from Australia, who was oddly enough, one of my top climbing partners, was out visiting in the mid-90s. We had just come back from a trip climbing at City of Rocks in southern Idaho, and I got a note from the American Alpine Club that they were looking to hire a position, and I was like, well, this would be super cool because again, I've been able to dip my toe into working on some of these climbing access and policy issues. When I was lobbying in the legislature for a state agency, one legislator had gotten his hairs on the back of his neck up over some mountaineers who needed to have a rescue on Mount Hood, and he was starting the nation's first charge for rescue bill. And so I, in my private time, fought that. And I was like, well, this is kind of fun doing this stuff about, it's one thing when you're working on workers' compensation or foodborne illness and stuff. And very societally important issues, but it really wasn't hitting my personal spot of bringing me great personal joy. And so being able to work on climbing stuff, I was like, oh, that could be super cool. So I came out here, and that was 29 years ago. I spent a decade working as the deputy director of the American Alpine Club. So was able to work on some important things, a lot related to fixed anchors in wilderness. I was helping some of the national parks work on human waste removal systems. I was able to go up to Denali and be on the mountain there and work with developing the Clean Mountain can technology. And so, spent a decade there, did a little detour for about 3 years in private land conservation work. Then my wife kind of foolishly at some point said, hey, you should maybe get back and get an easy job, like work for CFI. And, ever since then, she's rarely seen me because it's a pretty full-on position, probably 6-7 days a week most of the year, but getting to do what I love and, still get out. I've climbed to the summit of 14ers, both here in Colorado and in California, 110 times, and skied a few of the Colorado 14ers and climbed a few of them in winter, and still try to get out as much as I'm able. A colleague and I who do the work on the Trail Counter program, most days the summit is never our destination. So, we might go out to Gray's Peak and hike up to our trail counter there and collect data, and then come back and get in the truck and then go over to Quandary and go there, and then go to Mount Democrat. So sometimes he and I probably have the record of climbing to maybe 12,000 feet on 14ers, but not getting anywhere close to the summit. So who knows? That's like other hundreds of days spent getting out on those peaks.
And I'm sure those days are just terrible. I'm really feeling bad.
Zach is jealous. Yeah.
Yeah. And that sounds like a dream job, to be quite honest.
It does have the flip side. And I think this is where, sometimes friends will see my Facebook feed and be like, what? Do you just get paid to hike? And they don't realize that you're also thinking like, God, I've got, 4 grants due, and I've got to get this fundraising letter out, and I've got all of the work stuff. And then you're looking intensely at the calendar and like weather forecast and when can I get out. But I've, there have been plenty of days where I've been trying to crank out getting like as many of these trail counters as possible before storms come in, before then a mountain gets fully snowed in the fall, And so there's oftentimes a lot of pressure on getting this stuff done when the conditions allow. So you're oftentimes checking off a list, and it's less of that. Yeah. I'm just out here to have fun today. I mean, there are plenty of days when you're having fun, but I have hiked, what were they? Maybe like about 4 to 5 foot long metal posts to the top of Mount Chavano to pound in, install signs for liability reasons, because CFI owns the summit of Mount Chavano. So it's not always purely the fun that someone would have hiking a 14er, but it is pretty cool. You get to see some amazing sights, and you're out there and living life on these mountains.
Yeah.
Part of me was thinking you're just trying to talk it down just to
get rid of the competition.
I always make sure that I post in around Thanksgiving a massive stack of letters that I'm signing. So for anyone who wants to say that I have this just amazingly cushy, cool job, I will ask you to write your name about 3,000 times and then jot notes to, let's say, about 250 people on those. And so when your hand is totally seized up, you tell me that I have the perfect job over the whole 12 months of the year. In the summer to fall, I'm going to guess that it is pretty high on the cool factor.
Yeah.
In a lot of the other parts of the year, it's a lot of just office drudgery.
Yeah, getting ready for that 4 months where you actually have a window to work.
I'm curious, you've been to over 100 summits, but do you have a favorite 14er?
I'm at this weird place where I've done, if we're doing the lists, right? I've done 43 of the 53 and 48 of the 58. So I haven't done, and may never do, some of the hardest ones. I mean, I've done far harder climbs when I was younger. As each year passes, my degree to deal with exposure and bad rock and not the ability to protect goes down precipitously, right? Yep. So I probably won't climb all of them. I would have to say that my favorite 14er I've climbed to date was going up with a colleague and climbing the Kilpacker Basin route on El Diente Peak.
Yeah.
That was just a super fun route, and you get to this little small airy summit, and we had it on a day where I think we had one other person pop up on the summit who was doing some of the mountains in the Wilsons there, but it was just a lovely climb and great to be out there. Oddly enough, I have a real affinity for Mount Chavano, even though some might consider it one of the more sucky mountains out there. It'll be much better when we get our route done, but because we went up and bought the summit and I explored around and was able to find one of the old survey posts from the initial laying out of the mining claims in the early 1900s. Oh, wow. You know, that mountain has a lot of personal resonance, but yeah, I'd say El Diente is kind of a favorite.
That's very cool.
Neat. You guys keep track of usage of 14ers. You see the conditions on 14ers. I always have this question and this fear. Are we loving our 14ers to death?
That is a question that I hear often, and it makes the hair on the back of my neck bristle, because
what about it?
It's based on a faulty assumption of what's happening. So as I mentioned earlier, these mountains were first climbed without formal trails. What we found over the years is that the greatest amount of resource damage happens when there is no formal trail, and there can be exceptionally light hiking use. But after you get past a group of 5 or 10 occasionally being on a mountain every now and again, once you start getting trampling of vegetation, if it's not done in a planned way, you have trail braids, you have trails and things going in places where they shouldn't be. So you, relatively speaking, have more damage happening with a small amount of use on no planned trails versus having a lot of people who are following leave no trace practices and staying on a designed, maintained trail. So it's not the use, it's where it's happening and how it's happening. This is where I would liken it to love. I mean, there's a difference between like good, positive love relationships and abusive relationships, right? And it's sort of the sort of thing. It's not so much the volume of use, it's whether it's happening in the right place and in a controlled manner.
Interesting. That seems to suggest too that at some point, I mean, as people expand their kind of hiking vocabulary, they're moving more and more towards 13ers. You foresee a day where we move more, where CFI is also a CTI, where you guys start doing more 13ers, because some 13ers are starting to get used quite a bit and have social trailing and so forth.
Yeah, that's another issue that we oftentimes deal with. And that's, again, driven by this perception of high use on the 14ers is a bad thing, which I would contend. I mean, at some point with certain places, you just have trailheads overwhelmed. You have, trailhead communities feeling the burden of too many people trying to get there, right? Like people don't want to be on a conga line for 3,000 feet up a peak. Like, I get it. There's some point where you will have limits on the number of people who can practically get there and not overwhelm the resources in that area. There are some people who will prefer, the term in outdoor recreation management is called displacement. And people will, either regulations displace people, or someone wants solitude, and so they're not going to find it on a 14er, so they're going to go to a 13er. That all has to be handled in a very comprehensive manner. I was involved in a planning process in Clear Creek County, which has Grays, Torreys, and Bierstadt, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, three of the most climbed peaks. And there were some people saying like, there are too many people. Let's shove them out to the 13ers. And I'm like, great. So, you know, we have $18.5 million worth of work that's needed to bring the 14ers up to where we think they should be. Now what you want to do is send people off to mountains that don't have any formal trails, don't have likely comprehensively developed trailheads with toilet facilities and things like that. All you're really doing is, you know, squeezing the balloon, saying there are too many people here, let's send them over there. And we have a great analogy here in that, you know, I-70, which is our vital highway corridor through the mountains, is designed to have a lot of traffic on it. Now, it still gets overwhelmed when there are so many people on peak summer weekends or ski days or what have you. But when, say, a rock slide closes that highway and people are looking to get off on all sorts of other roads, the chaos is just overwhelming of people trying to go through. So realistically, most people tend to be kind of list driven. So the 14ers have their list. The 8,000 meter peaks in the world have their list, the 8,000 peaks. There's the 3,000 footers in the Northeast, and there's I think it's the 4,000 meter peaks in Europe, right? So people like to do that. Most people want to come out to the 14ers. Those people who feel like the conditions totally changed from when I first went out there 20, 30 years ago, great, go to a random 13er someplace. You're probably going to have the mountain all to yourself. Mm-hmm. At some point, the most climbed 14ers, the Centennials, maybe there's going to be a call from land managers to say, hey, we need to focus here. I don't know whether we're the group that does it. I mean, certainly we can help with that effort, but we still have plenty of work to do with the 14ers. There hasn't been an effort to go to the 13ers yet. Thankfully, the list is actually getting very small in terms of the peaks that don't have planned routes. You know, Mount Princeton is one that's been planned, and we're going to be on there. I was last June on Snowmass Mountain, and noted that, man, that route just totally sucked, and that it was one of these old school climber routes, and I'm thrashing around off route in the bushes someplace, and I was like, man, this is not so fun, but there are some issues there where the local ranger district might not want to put in a trail. There are some kind of secondary or tertiary routes. Most of the mountains that don't have a sustainable route, either planned or in construction, are ones where we have private land issues. There are things like Mount Lindsay. There are Mount Sherman, which is its own crazy little thing for the future. People don't know this, that pretty much the whole sweep of land over the 13er Mount Sheridan and 14er Mount Sherman is owned by a defunct mining company. And that has been in bankruptcy court for several years by two sort of rival creditor groups. Very likely that's going to be decided soon. And CFI is teaming up with some others to try to figure out how can we acquire those lands. But there's been no trail work on that mountain. So very few that don't have work. Certainly there are things like we still need to get back to the upper portion of Mount Columbia. Rocky Mountain Field Institute, a group out of the Springs, has been working on the Devil's Playground route on Pikes Peak. So there are some, but most peaks have some route in. It just might need more work.
Well, Lloyd, this has been super informative. I really appreciate your perspective. You probably know more about trail design, maintenance, and the status of Colorado's trails than probably anybody. If people want to volunteer, donate, etc., how do they reach the Colorado 14ers initiative?
A lot of connecting with us comes through our website, which is 14ers. So that's the number 1 and the number 4, ERS.org. And people are more familiar with 14ers.com, which is a privately run website, but 14ers.org is the way you get in contact with us. There you'll find links to online donation portals. We also post when we're having volunteer signups, and we have a conduit for people to sign up for our projects. We also have presence on Facebook and Instagram, so they can look there to get more frequently updated information about what we're doing, photos of projects, those sorts of things. And then we have a YouTube channel, which is CO 14ers Initiative, and that's where people can find all of our educational videos about all things related to the 14ers that they might find interesting and exciting and help with safety and having a better experience on the 14ers.
Awesome. And I saw that you're giving a talk in the future here. Do you have talks that you routinely give? And if so, where could people find those?
Again, we try to disseminate information through our social media channels, but I and some other colleagues will try to get out as best we can to share the message. We have our volunteer peak stewards that will put on how to climb a 14er clinic at REIs and sometimes other outdoor gear shops and community events. So if people are in Colorado, they're certainly better place to connect with us. But again, we try to do a lot through YouTube, social media to kind of get information out to people who live in other parts of the country. Because when I've done sort of a multi-year look back, strangely, we only had no donors in the state of West Virginia. So if there's one of your listeners in the state of West Virginia, like get someone to show up, because every other state has people giving money to us. And we have people in about 5 or 6 foreign countries that donate, and people come. Strangely enough, people will fly from New England and Florida to Texas to come and do volunteer projects. I mean, it's pretty amazing the connection that hikers have with the peaks and with our efforts on them. So we're always happy to have people out and get involved in whatever works best for them.
Well, people in West Virginia, get your act together.
West Virginia needs to step up.
Step up to the plate. Come on.
It's funny, and I just hired someone who grew up in West Virginia. So I'm like, talk to some of your, relatives, man. Get someone to show up.
Thank you so much, Lloyd, for your time here. This has been super informative. Hopefully we get to do this again and hear about project updates and so forth in the coming years. But thank you so much for the work you guys do, too. I think without you guys, the mountains may be kind of loved to death, right? But you make it so that we can do this in a way that doesn't adversely impact the environment. So I'm really grateful for that.
Well, thank you guys. Appreciate being on the show and hope this is informative to your listeners.
Thanks so much. Well, Eric, that was a really interesting, fun conversation with Lloyd Athearn. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. Really appreciated him taking the time with us. I guess something that stood out to me as we were talking with him was he seems like he's perfect for the job. Like, he has plenty of nonprofit experience. He certainly has a strategic leadership kind of a mindset. One thing, it seems like he has to be super diplomatic and really be able to relate with and work with a lot of different kinds of people. So I just think it's great that he's there. I'm really thankful that he is heading up the CFI and that he's been doing it for as long as he has, and that he's was willing to spend time with a couple of schmoes like us talking about the strategy and the inner workings of the CFI, as well as what kind of makes him tick and why he's so passionate about the mountains. So yeah, that was a really fun conversation. So what do you think, Zach?
I totally echo your thoughts about Lloyd. He seemed great, and it really reinforced it when he ran through the list of things that the CFI does. I was just kind of like taken aback, like, okay, I thought you guys just did trails. And like they're negotiating land use and they're doing a lot of fundraising. And I mean, the list of things that they're engaged in, I really appreciate what they do. They make some of what we do possible. And I also really loved his answer about whether or not we're loving our mountains to death. That's a kind of constant preoccupation of mine. Like, are we diminishing the wilderness by being in it? And I thought his answer was great, and it fit with their mission. It's like, well, maintaining trails isn't the problem. And in fact, it gets people, we're making sure that people use trails in a way that doesn't erode the character of these places. I found myself afterwards really resonating with that statement. So really appreciated Lloyd and the work that CFI does. I'm so grateful for everything they do. Thought he was just a wealth of information, and I hope we can, kind of like everybody else we've ever had on here, like I'd love to have that guy back on again and just every year, like Lloyd's Corner. He just kind of fills us in on what they're up to, what he's up to, where things are at, so that we know kind of what mountains are getting worked that year and how we might actually avoid them and make their lives a little easier. Because you mentioned that a number of times, like it's kind of hard when people walk through while we're trying to work here.
Well, with that, Zach, if anyone wants to contact us for any reason, how can they do that?
Well, I mean, the best place is through our Gmail account, which is greensandbluespodcast@gmail.com. Very logical.
Yeah, makes sense.
Always surprises me no one had taken that one. And
we snuck in there.
You snuck in there at the last second. We have a Facebook page where we update, or I shouldn't say we, Eric updates rather regularly. You can also find us on a YouTube channel that Eric, of course, has started up. And then you can find me at Twitter at NMHikerPerson or Blue Sky, Zach.Simpson. And those are good places to find both of us. Or since it's the beginning of summer here, you may find one of us on a mountain at some point too.
Just throw a rock at us and say hi.
Maybe a small one.
Yeah, we'll hope that you miss.
And maybe at my feet. But other than that, hopefully we get to see you guys in the hills one of these days.